The road to Crystal Lake curved through pines and mist, the kind of road Robert Hayes used to love driving with Martha beside him. Now, 3 years after her death, the silence in the car felt heavier than the luggage in the trunk. The villa waited at the end of the gravel drive, a sanctuary he'd built with his own hands, a place for peace. But peace ended the moment he saw two figures standing on the terrace. White bathrobes, coffee mugs, laughter. His daughter Anna leaned against the railing, her dark hair catching the evening light. Behind her stood Ethan, her husband already stiffening when he noticed Robert's car. Robert stepped out, blinking against the glare. Anna. She didn't smile. "Dad, you can't stay here." He froze. "What are you talking about? This is my place. It's our weekend," she said, the words clipped impatient. "You should have called first." Ethan mumbled something, but she waved him off. Her tone turned cold. "Next time, call before using my house." For a moment, Robert couldn't breathe. He'd built this villa 30 years ago. Every tile, every beam carried memories of Martha's laughter. Now his only child was pushing him off his own land. He dropped his bag, then slowly picked it up again. "Fine," he said, voice cracking. "Enjoy your weekend." As he drove away, Anna's reflection shimmered in the rearview mirror, smiling carefree, already erasing him. 3 nights later, his phone rang. "Dad," Anna said flatly, "we've decided. The villa now belongs to Ethan's parents. You're not allowed there anymore." Robert said nothing. He just looked at Martha's photograph on his desk and whispered, "If they want to steal my home, the house will fight back." The night after Anna's call, Robert Hayes sat alone at his kitchen table in Boulder. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock ticked, and every sound in the house seemed to echo too loud. Across from him sat the empty chair where Martha used to drink her evening tea. Her photo rested on the counter, half lit by the dim lamp, that gentle smile frozen in time, unaware of what her family would become. He stirred his coffee until it went cold. Shame burned through him stronger than the bitterness of the drink. His daughter had ordered him off his own property like an intruder. Worse, she'd sounded certain that she had every right to do so. Outside, the Colorado wind pushed against the window pane. The world went on as if nothing had changed. Inside, Robert felt something inside him, something patient, decent, beginning to crack. He returned to work the next morning, though his mind wasn't on the blueprints in front of him. Hayes Construction had been his life's work. For 30 years, he'd built homes for other families, warm, safe, proud homes. Yet the one place that had meant everything to him was now off limits by decree of his own child. Morning boss, one of his crew, called out, but Robert barely nodded. He spent the day reviewing project notes. He couldn't focus on rereading invoices without understanding a single line. Every nail, every wall he'd built seemed to mock him now. That evening, as he locked up the office, he noticed a faded photo pinned to the corkboard, a younger Anna, 10 years old, sitting on his shoulders in front of their newly finished lake villa. Both of them were smiling. Martha had taken the photo. He pulled it down, staring at the edges worn soft from years of sunlight. That little girl used to call him her hero. Now she called his home hers. Anna had changed after her mother's death. Robert could trace the decline like a builder reading cracks in a wall, slow, subtle, inevitable. At first she'd withdrawn. Then she'd started calling only when she needed something. Tuition, car payments, a new apartment deposit. Every time he said yes, every time he told himself it was love. He remembered her voice when she'd asked for wedding help. "Dad, Ethan's family isn't doing great. Could you maybe cover the reception deposit?" He'd paid it without hesitation. $10,000 gone before she'd even sent an invitation. When the marriage began to wobble a year later, she called again. "We're just struggling, Dad. Ethan lost hours at work. Maybe you could help until he finds something steady." And he did. Again. Every check was an apology for her grief, every favor a silent plea not to lose what was left of his family. But grief wasn't what this was anymore. It was habit, her taking him giving. And now she'd gone too far. The phone buzzed again 2 nights later. "Dad, about the villa," Anna said briskly, as if discussing groceries. "I'm just confirming everything's settled. Ethan's parents are visiting next weekend. You don't even use the place and they need it more." Robert clenched the receiver. "Anna, you can't just give away something that's not yours. You barely go there," she argued. "They're practically family now." "They're not my family," he said quietly. There was a pause, then the sharpness returned to her tone. You're being selfish. He almost laughed. Selfish. After 30 years of working to give you everything, maybe it's time you stopped thinking only about yourself, she snapped. The call ended with a cold click. Robert stared at the silent phone for a long time. Then for the first time in his life, he opened his laptop and began saving the evidence call logs, messages, recordings. He wasn't going to yell this time. He was going to document. By Friday, his patience had hardened into purpose. He made an appointment downtown with Susan Lee, the attorney who had once handled his business contracts. Her office overlooked the snowy peaks west of the city, bright and sterile in the morning light. Robert, she greeted, shaking his hand. It's been years. What brings you back to my side of the desk? Family trouble? He said simply. She raised an eyebrow, but waited. He explained everything, the Villa Anna's demands, the threats. As he spoke, his voice stayed even, but the muscle in his jaw worked with every sentence. Susan listened, jotting notes in tidy cursive. You still hold the deed? Yes, paid in full, built it myself. Then she has no legal standing. But if she's trying to transfer possession through pressure or emotional coercion, coercion, he echoed. It's a legal term, Susan said, when someone uses guilt or manipulation to force you into signing or surrendering property. It happens more often than you'd think, especially within families. Robert exhaled slowly. What can I do? First, verify all ownership documents. Then secure them physically and digitally. We can add protective clauses if needed. And Robert, she leaned forward, you might want to start recording your interactions. These situations can turn ugly fast. He nodded, feeling both embarrassed and strangely relieved. For the first time, someone else saw what was happening and called it by its real name. When he left her office, the winter air felt sharper, cleaner. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't overreacting. He was being robbed not by strangers, but by blood. That night he sat on his porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the faint lights of neighboring houses. The city felt colder than usual, even with the heater running. A familiar voice broke the quiet. Long day, he turned. Mark Rivera, his next-door neighbor, stood leaning on the fence holding a toolbox. Mark was the kind of man who wore hoodies year-round and had gadgets blinking in every room. Just thinking, Robert said. About family, about boundaries. Mark chuckled. Dangerous topics. Robert hesitated, then said, You ever wish a house could defend itself, like kick out whoever doesn't belong there? Mark laughed. Depends on the tech budget. I'm serious, Robert said. If someone tried to take your place, could you make it fight back? The engineer's grin widened. With motion sensors, voice assistants, automated systems. Sure, you could scare the hell out of them. Legally, too. Robert stared into the darkness for a long moment. The idea settled in his mind like a blueprint taking shape. Mark frowned slightly. You okay? Robert nodded. Yeah, I think I finally am. He finished his coffee, stood, and looked toward the distant mountains, toward Crystal Lake, where his sanctuary had been stolen. The wind carried the scent of pine and snow, and somewhere inside that wind he thought he could hear Martha's voice again, faint but clear. Protect what we built. He went back inside and opened a folder on his computer labeled Lake Villa, Plans. It had once contained blueprints for renovations and maintenance schedules. Now it would hold something else entirely, a plan. If this were your home, would you forgive or would you fight back? Subscribe and stay to see how this father answers. Sunlight once spilled over the wooden deck of the Crystal Lake Villa, warm and golden. The air smelled of pine and fresh paint. 10-year-old Anna laughed as she dipped a brush into a bucket of sky blue color, splattering more on her sneakers than on the railing. Easy there, Robert said, grinning. We're painting the porch, not each other. From inside, Martha called out, Let her have fun. It's her summer home, too. Robert turned toward her. Martha, with her straw hat tilted against the sun. Her cheeks flushed a streak of paint on her forearm. She'd chosen the color herself, saying it matched the morning light on the lake. When the last board was coated, the three of them stepped back to admire their work. Martha looped her arms around Robert's waist. This house will always protect what's built with love, she whispered. Anna looked up. Does that mean it'll protect us too? Martha smiled. Especially us. Robert lifted Anna onto his shoulders, the little girl squealing as the lake shimmered below them, a mirror of peace and family. Years later, that laughter had faded to silence. The same deck stood empty when Robert carried Martha back inside after her final hospital visit. The chemo had stolen her hair, but not her calm. On one of her last nights, he sat by her bedside in the hospital, holding her hand as the monitor beeped steadily. "Be patient with her, Rob," Martha murmured, her voice a thread of sound. "She'll need time to grieve. Promise me you won't lose her." He squeezed her fingers, blinking away tears. "I promise. I won't lose her." "She's young," Martha continued. "When I'm gone, she'll be angry at the world, maybe at you. But don't give up on her. She's all you'll have left." He nodded. He meant it. Back then it had felt like a vow made to heaven itself. He didn't know it would become a chain around his heart. After the funeral, the house in Boulder turned into a museum of quiet. Robert tried to fill it with life again. He called Anna every night, cooked her favorite meals, left the porch light on whenever she promised to visit. At first she came, then the visits shortened, then the calls stopped. He found himself standing at the kitchen window, watching snow fall over the empty driveway, waiting for headlights that never came. When she did call, it was always for something: "Dad, can you help with rent?" "Dad, the car broke down again." And he said yes every time, because saying no felt like betraying Martha's last wish. Sometimes late at night he played Martha's old voicemail just to hear her voice again. "Hi, sweetheart, I'm at the lake. Don't forget to water the lilies." The sound of her laughter at the end, that tiny human sound, was enough to shatter him every time. Now, years later, Robert sat in his office surrounded by framed photos and silence. On the shelf above his desk stood a picture from that long-ago summer: Martha in her straw hat, Anna on his shoulders, sunlight everywhere. He took it down carefully. Dust rose like ghostly mist. For a moment he could almost feel the warmth of that day again, the laughter, the scent of paint, the hope. Then the memory shifted and he saw what he hadn't before. Martha's eyes in the photo weren't just happy. They were certain. Protect what we built. He'd misunderstood those words for years. He'd thought protection meant surrender, patience, forgiveness without limits. But Martha hadn't meant submission. She'd meant strength. The villa wasn't just a house, it was a legacy. It held the proof that love could build something lasting, and that no one, not even his own daughter, had the right to destroy it. He set the photo back on the shelf straighter than before and whispered to the empty room. "You were right, Martha. It's time to protect it properly this time." The wind outside rustled through the window pane like an answer, soft but resolute. Wednesday morning arrived with an unshakable calm, the kind that usually preceded storms. Robert Hayes sat at his desk, phone in hand, rereading the latest message from Anna. "Ethan's parents are coming to the villa this weekend. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." He stared at the screen for a long moment before setting it down beside his coffee. The words had no emotion, no hesitation, just entitlement carved into text. He looked toward the framed photograph of Martha above the bookshelf. 4 days, he murmured. 4 days to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the gutters, rhythmic and deliberate. Robert felt the same way, melting, transforming. The man who once built homes for others was now building something else entirely. A trap wrapped in courtesy, a message hidden in code. That afternoon he drove to Mark Rivera's place. The garage door was open, spilling the sharp light of computer monitors across a sea of cables, circuit boards, and half-assembled gadgets. "Hey, Rob," Mark greeted, wiping grease off his hands. "You look like a man on a mission," something like that, Robert said, stepping into the cluttered lab. "I need your help. Creative project." Mark's eyes lit up. "Now we're talking. What kind of project?" "Home automation," Robert replied, his tone careful. "Motion sensors, voice assistants, lights that react to movement. I want the house to respond." "Respond how?" Mark asked, suspicious but intrigued. "Let's just say," Robert said slowly, "to make sure unwelcome guests feel unwelcome." Mark's grin spread wide. "Oh, I like that. Defensive tech, fully automated deterrent system." Robert watched him pull open drawers full of sensors and microcontrollers. The hum of machinery filled the air like anticipation. "We'll need motion detectors, water controllers, wireless speakers, LED arrays, maybe even projectors for visuals." Mark listed, already scribbling on a notepad. How aggressive do you want it? Loud, Robert said without hesitation, loud enough to make them remember. Mark paused mid-scribble. You're serious? Dead serious. Okay then. Mark clapped his hands once. Let's build something beautiful. By the next morning, they were loading his SUV with boxes, motion sensors, the size of smoke alarms, a spool of Ethernet cable, multiple tablets for system control. Mark's excitement filled the car as they headed north toward Crystal Lake. Think of it like an interactive haunted house, Mark said, half joking. Only instead of Halloween, it's karma. Robert didn't laugh. Just make sure it's legal. Everything we're installing is off the shelf, Mark assured him. You're not hurting anyone, just making them uncomfortable. It's your property, your system, perfectly lawful. The drive took 3 hours. As they neared the lake, pine trees framed the narrow road like cathedral pillars. The air grew colder, purer. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel when the villa came into view. His villa standing quiet, patient, unknowing of the battle to come. Mark stepped out first, whistling. Beautiful place. I see why you're fighting for it. Robert said nothing. He walked to the porch, touched the railing he'd painted decades ago with Martha, and nodded. Let's begin. The installation took 2 full days. Mark mapped every entry point, doors, windows, hallways, placing motion sensors at strategic corners. LED lights snaked along the ceilings, invisible unless triggered. Hidden speakers hid behind furniture and vents. Cameras blended into wall fixtures, feeding live video back to Robert's tablet. Here, Mark explained, pointing at the monitor. When they enter, the motion triggers the lights strobing red and white. Then, a voice message plays through all speakers. What kind of message? Mark grinned. Something like, unauthorized presence detected. Please vacate immediately. Robert nodded approvingly. Good. Then what phase 2 if movement continues? Faucets turn on. Showers run. The voice becomes more aggressive. You are not the owners of this property. You get the idea. Robert stared at the floorboards under his feet, remembering Martha's laughter, echoing in this very room. Make it unsettling, not dangerous. It should feel like the house itself rejects them. Done, Mark said, adjusting a control panel. We'll program random water activations and ghostly sound loops, footsteps, whispers, wind. Classic psychological pressure. By nightfall, the system was alive. They stood in the dim living room, the tablet glowing between them. Mark initiated a test run. Instantly, lights flashed in rhythmic pulses. A low mechanical voice filled the air. This property belongs to Robert Hayes. You are trespassing. Leave immediately. Robert shivered, not from fear, but from how real it felt. It works. Oh, it works perfectly, Mark said, pride in his voice. We could add a projector or 2 moving shadows on the walls just for effect. Robert considered it. Do it. They worked through the night wires, snaking behind bookshelves, tiny cameras hidden inside vents. At 3 a.m., the villa was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing organism, one that recognized its owner and rejected imposters. By Friday, Mark ran a final diagnostic. Every system checked out. The battery backups can run for 72 hours if they cut the main power, he explained. You'll control everything remotely through this tablet or your phone. I've set it to notify you when motion is detected. Robert looked around the house one last time. The air smelled faintly of solder and pine creation, and memory intertwined. Mark unplugged his laptop. You know, he said lightly, this could scare people half to death. Robert's reply was calm, measured. Then, maybe they'll think twice before stealing what isn't theirs. Mark hesitated. Who are they, anyway? Robert gave a faint smile. Family. That single word hung in the room like a confession. When Mark finally drove back to Boulder, Robert stayed behind. He walked from room to room, inspecting sensors, running one last test. The house responded faithfully, each time, lights flashing, water, surging, speakers booming. It felt less like revenge and more like justice made tangible. As dusk fell, he sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the lake turn black beneath the moon. Somewhere across the water, an owl called. He took out his phone and typed a final message to Anna. I hope you find what you're looking for this weekend. No reply came. Inside the villa, the control lights glowed faintly blue, waiting. Robert closed the door behind him, the lock clicking with a sound that felt final. The tablet screen displayed a single message: "System armed, monitoring active." He smiled faintly, whispering to the darkness, "Let's see what love can build when it finally fights back." That night, sleep refused to come. Robert moved through the villa like a ghost, barefoot on the cool wooden floor. Every creak felt alive, every reflection a fragment of memory. In the kitchen he found the old coffee mug Martha used, pale green with a chip near the handle. He poured himself half a cup and sat at the table. The lights dimmed to a low amber glow. The lake shimmered beyond the window moonlight, painting a thin silver path across the water. He imagined Martha walking along that line, turning once to smile at him the way she used to when she caught him working too late. "You always fix everything, Rob," she would say. "But you can't fix people. Just build stronger walls." He hadn't understood her then. Now he did. He opened the tablet again, reviewing each automation one last time. Lights check, audio check, motion sensors armed. The house was ready. Still doubt crept in. Was this revenge? Was he betraying Martha's kindness by turning their sanctuary into a stage for fear? He closed his eyes, hearing her voice in memory. "Protect what we built." When he opened them, the decision was solid. Protecting something sacred didn't always look gentle. Sometimes it meant standing up when love had turned into manipulation. He rose, set the mug down carefully, and whispered, "I'm not punishing her, Martha. I'm teaching her." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint echo across the lake, as if the house itself agreed. Sunday came bright and calm, too calm. The kind of morning that made the world seem innocent. Robert sat in his study in Boulder, 3 monitors glowing before him. One showed a live feed from the front gate of the Crystal Lake Villa. Another displayed the interior cameras, still and waiting. The last screen pulsed with the words, "System armed, standby mode." At exactly 10:02 a.m., motion appeared on the gate camera. A dark blue minivan rolled into view, sunlight flashing across its windshield. Robert leaned closer. Anna was the first to step out. Her hair gleamed in the late morning light, tied neatly as if she were attending a brunch rather than a takeover. Behind her came Ethan, tall, composed, playing the part of the supportive husband. Then slowly 2 older figures emerged, Linda and George Moore, her in-laws. They carried luggage, flower pots, and boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom. Robert's jaw tightened. Not a visit, he thought. A move-in. Anna pointed toward the villa, talking animatedly, gesturing as if she were the realtor showing new owners around. Even through the camera's microphone, her voice carried. "Dad probably left it a mess, but don't worry. We'll make it feel like home." Linda smiled thinly. "It's generous of him to let us have it." Robert chuckled without humor. "Generous," he muttered to himself. "That's one word for it." They reached the front door, where the metal sign gleamed in the sunlight. "Welcome to the future home. Enter at your own risk." Linda squinted at it. What on earth is this supposed to mean? Ethan shrugged. Probably one of Dad's little jokes. Anna smirked. He thinks he's clever. Ignore it. Then with a sharp tug, Linda tore the sign off the wall and tossed it into the bushes. There. Problem solved. Robert leaned back in his chair. "Fair warning given," he said softly. Fair warning ignored. On screen, Ethan inserted a key, one he must have copied years ago from Robert's spare. The lock clicked. The door opened. 4 people stepped over the threshold like conquerors. Inside, the sensors blinked awake. The first motion trigger activated in the entryway. Lights brightened unnaturally, then flickered twice, once like a warning, once like a heartbeat. "Did you see that?" George asked, glancing upward. "Probably just old wiring," Ethan said, waving it off. They continued deeper into the living room. The second motion sensor engaged. Every overhead light switched from warm yellow to strobing white. "Okay, that's weird," Anna said, laughing nervously. Then the voice came. Deep, metallic calm. "Unauthorized presence detected. This property belongs to Robert Hayes." The sound rolled through the house from every direction. Ceiling vents, walls, floors. Linda froze, eyes wide. "What was that?" George frowned. "Some kind of recording?" "Dad," Anna shouted, half angry, half afraid. "This isn't funny." No answer came, only the hum of the system resetting for its next sequence. The third motion trigger went off as they moved toward the hallway. Faucets opened in this kitchen and bathroom simultaneously, water rushing with a roar. The lights began flashing red, now syncopated like an alarm. "You are trespassing. Vacate immediately." Linda screamed. "Turn it off! Make it stop!" Ethan hurried to the electrical panel near the kitchen. "I've got it. I'll shut the breaker." He yanked the main switch down. Nothing happened. The voice continued, unbothered. "Leave this house. Leave now." From the vents came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate circling. Anna spun around. "Who's there?" No one. Only shadows shifting across the walls as a projector flickered to life, casting ghostly silhouettes that moved when they didn't. "Mom?" "There's someone in here," Ethan shouted. "There's no one," Linda cried, clutching her chest. "The walls are talking." In his study, Robert watched the chaos unfold in silence. Every screen showed motion, living room, hallway, kitchen, all four of them darting from room to room like trapped birds. Mark's programming performed flawlessly. The sensors cascaded responses, lights flashing faster the more they moved, water erupting from more faucets, sound effects layering, whispers beneath the voice commands. For a moment, Robert almost felt pity. Almost. "You are not the owners of this house. Intrusion detected. Security alert." The words overlapped louder each time. "Ethan, open the damn door," Anna yelled. "I'm trying." He pulled the handle, but the smart lock delayed release by 30 seconds, enough to let panic settle deep. Robert watched Anna's face on the monitor, pale, wet with sweat, her confidence shattered. She screamed something that the audio feed barely caught. "Dad, stop this." He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice too quiet to transmit but heavy in his office. "Now you remember I exist." Back in the villa, George stumbled into the living room, gasping. "We have to get out, Anna. This place isn't right." "The doors are locked," she cried. From the ceiling, the voice shifted tone, now calm, almost human. "Final warning, leave immediately." Then silence. For 5 seconds, everything stilled. The only sound was their own breathing. Then, every faucet, every shower, every light in the villa activated at once. The noise was deafening, a waterfall of chaos. Linda shrieked. Ethan covered his ears. Anna clutched the doorframe, trembling. When the main door finally unlocked, they bolted outside, soaked and shaking. Robert exhaled slowly, switching the system to standby. Through the camera feed, he watched them stagger across the driveway toward the van. Anna turned once, looking back at the villa with an expression torn between rage and disbelief. He almost turned off the monitors right then, but the phone on his desk began to ring. "Anna." He hesitated, then answered. "What did you do?" Her voice was raw, frantic. "Good morning," Robert said evenly. "You sound upset." "Upset?" "The house went insane, lights flashing, water pouring, voices screaming at us to leave. You could have killed us." "I told you not to go there," he replied. "You think this is a game? Mom would be ashamed of you." That name, Mom, landed like a strike. Robert's hand tightened on the receiver. "Your mother built that house with me, and she'd be ashamed of what you've become. Don't you dare." He cut her off gently. Maybe the house just didn't like strangers. There was silence. Then the sound of her breathing, ragged and furious. "You can't prove anything," she spat. "The police already came. They said it was just a malfunction." "Then it must have been," Robert said. "Those smart systems can be unpredictable." "This isn't over," she whispered. "No," he said softly. "It isn't." He hung up the click, echoing through the quiet study. On the monitors, the villa stood perfectly still under the pale morning sun. Not haunted, not broken, just awake. Robert sat there for a while, staring at the monitors as the image of the villa faded into static. His hand hovered over the power button but didn't press it right away. For a man who'd spent a lifetime building things, destroying something, even a false sense of family felt like breaking his own code. He muted the feed and leaned back, exhaustion settling deeper than sleep. The hum of the machines filled the room, steady and indifferent. For the first time, he wondered what Anna looked like as a child, not in photos but in memory. How small her hands had been when she'd helped him hammer the first nail in that deck. How proud she'd been when Martha said, "You've got your father's patience." He rubbed his eyes, exhaling a tremor that wasn't quite guilt, not quite peace. "You took everything I gave you," he whispered, "but not who I am." The words stayed in the air like smoke, faint and final. Then he reached forward and shut down the monitors one by one until the room went dark. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane softly, like an old friend reminding him he wasn't alone, just awake. Would you forgive after that, or keep fighting? subscribe, and stay to see what this father does next. The house on the screen finally went still. Robert sat in his study staring at the frozen image of the villa bathed in morning light. No more motion alerts, no more flashing lights or echoing voices, just silence. The kind of silence that used to comfort him before it started feeling like judgment. He closed the laptop. The faint click sounded louder than he expected. For a long moment he simply sat there, hands folded, pulse slowing. He should have felt satisfaction, justice, vindication. Instead, there was only a strange hollow calm, like standing on a mountain after an avalanche and realizing you survived, but nothing looks the same anymore. He whispered into the quiet, "Did I go too far?" The house, the lake, the very air outside offered no answer. He looked up at the photo of Martha on the wall. She was smiling in that effortless way that used to steady him when life grew too heavy. "I did what I had to," he said softly. "Didn't I?" But guilt moved quietly like dust in sunlight. That night he couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the living room barefoot on the cold hardwood, surrounded by the soft glow of family photographs. Martha at the lake, Anna at graduation, the three of them years ago laughing with cake on their faces. He poured whiskey into a glass and let the ice melt before he drank. The burn steadied him. He remembered the last night in the hospital, the way Martha's hand had felt weightless in his, her voice fading like radio static. "Kindness isn't weakness, Rob," she had said, "but don't let love blind you." He'd nodded, then not truly understanding. Back then, love had meant giving everything: time, money, patience, forgiveness, until there was nothing left of himself. Now he finally understood what she'd meant. He whispered, "You weren't asking me to surrender, were you?" "Martha, you were warning me." The memory of her smile softened the edge of guilt. She would never have wanted him to be humiliated, never wanted Anna to treat love like a transaction. He sat down, pulling out the old voicemail again, the one message he still kept from her phone. "Hi, sweetheart. Don't forget to water the lilies." He smiled through the ache. "The lilies are fine," he murmured. "You'd like what I did with the house." 2 days later, the world tried to drag him back into conflict. Anna's name appeared on his phone again. He let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was flat now, colder than the last time. "We're not done, Dad." Robert stayed silent. "We talked to a lawyer," she continued. "What you did, that psychological stunt, we could sue you for harassment, for damages." "Damages," he echoed quietly. "You broke into my home. You terrorized us," she snapped. "You used technology to attack your own family." Robert's voice stayed level. "I used technology to remind you it was mine. Mom would be." He cut her off gently. "Stop using her as your shield." For the first time, she didn't respond. The line went quiet except for her breathing. Then came a low whisper, "You'll regret this." Robert ended the call without another word. Later that evening, an email from Ethan appeared in his inbox, formal, self-righteous. Legal threats, demands for compensation, claims of trauma and defamation. Robert read every word, then calmly moved the message to a new folder labeled Evidence. He no longer shook when he dealt with their anger. No racing pulse, no guilt, just quiet certainty. They wanted to make it a war. He had already won the only battle that mattered inside himself. The next night, unable to sleep again, he drove north. The highway stretched dark and empty beneath the stars. The familiar scent of pine returned as he neared Crystal Lake. When he reached the edge of the property, he didn't go inside. He parked by the roadside, headlights off, and watched from a distance. The villa stood there like a memory reborn, still dignified, untouched. In the reflection of the lake, he saw both the house and his own face, older, wearier, but finally steady. He rolled down the window. The cold air carried the faint sound of water lapping against the dock. "It wasn't revenge," he said quietly. "It was a lesson." The wind answered with a soft sigh through the pines. He thought of Martha again, her patience, her humor, her strength. If she were here, maybe she'd scold him for the theatrics, for the fear he'd caused. But she'd also see the truth behind it, that he had finally stopped letting love be used against him. He stayed there for nearly an hour, watching the first hints of dawn touch the horizon. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel like a man abandoned. He felt like a man restored. When the sun rose, he took one last look at the villa. Then he whispered, "Time to set it free." On the drive back to Boulder, the decision solidified. He would call his lawyer Susan that morning. He would transfer the villa not to Anna, not to any family member, but to a foundation that helped veterans rebuild their lives. That way, something built with love could keep giving long after the people who misunderstood it were gone. He smiled as the lake disappeared behind the trees. Sometimes love meant sacrifice. Sometimes love meant letting go. And sometimes love meant saying no once and for all. Sometimes love means saying no. Subscribe if you believe standing up for yourself can still be an act of love. The next morning, Robert arrived at Susan Lee's office just as the city was waking. The sky over Boulder was pale and clean, brushed with a thin gold light. Inside, the law firm smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Order precision control. Susan was already waiting, files stacked neatly on the conference table. "You're early," she said, smiling faintly. "I didn't sleep much," Robert replied, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "I didn't think you would." She opened a folder, sliding a document toward him. "This is the property transfer contract. Once you sign, the villa at Crystal Lake will officially belong to the Home for Veterans Foundation. You'll retain lifetime residency rights, but ownership passes immediately." Robert read every line slowly, deliberately. The legal phrases were dense, but the meaning was clear. He was cutting the last thread tying Anna to his vulnerability. Susan handed him a pen. "Are you sure?" Robert looked out the window. Snow flurries drifted past the glass, glinting in the morning sun. "Yes," he said. "I built that house with love. Now it should stand for something better than greed." He signed. The ink gleamed wet for a moment, then dried, a quiet full stop at the end of 3 years of pain. Susan nodded. "You're not just protecting your property, Robert. You're setting yourself free." He exhaled through a faint smile. "Exactly." Later that afternoon, Susan's assistant announced that the Hayes appointment had arrived. But this time there were 4 names on the list. Anna entered first, her heels striking the tile like punctuation marks. Ethan followed, jaw tight, flanked by his parents, Linda clutching her handbag like a lifeline, George avoiding Robert's gaze. "Dad," Anna said curtly, "let's just make this quick." Robert didn't rise. That would be a first. They all sat. Susan closed the door behind them, her professional calm filling the room. "We're here to finalize matters regarding the Crystal Lake property." Finally, Anna said sharply, "We want the transfer signed today. No more games." Susan exchanged a brief glance with Robert, then opened the folder that now contained freshly signed papers. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Ms. Hayes. The property has already been transferred." Anna blinked. "What?" Ethan leaned forward. "Transferred to who?" "To the Home for Veterans Foundation," Susan said. "Mr. Hayes completed the donation this morning. The transfer is legally binding and irrevocable." Silence fell like a physical weight. Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. Anna's chair scraped across the floor as she shot to her feet. "You can't do that." Robert looked at her calmly. "I just did." That's insane. You gave it away to strangers, to people who've earned their peace," he replied. "People who understand value, not entitlement." Ethan's voice cracked. "But we counted on that place. We made plans." "That was your mistake," Robert said. "Making plans with something that was never yours." Anna's face flushed red. "You destroyed our future." He rose slowly, steady as stone. "No, Anna. I saved mine." Linda's voice trembled. "But where are we supposed to go? We already left our apartment." "That's unfortunate," Robert said evenly. "But it's not my problem anymore." George's shoulders slumped. Ethan stared at the floor, muttering curses under his breath. Anna turned to Susan, desperate. "Undo it. You can undo it." "I'm afraid I can't," Susan said gently. "The deed is recorded, notarized in public. There's nothing to reverse." Anna looked back at her father, her expression cracking between fury and disbelief. "How could you do this to me?" Robert's voice softened, not cruel, not triumphant, just final. "I spent 3 years mistaking patience for love and love for weakness. You turned my kindness into currency. I should have stopped you sooner." "You'll die alone," she hissed. He nodded once. Better alone than surrounded by thieves. The words hit the room like a hammer. Ethan stood abruptly, guiding his parents toward the door. Anna lingered, trembling eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Robert looked at her, his daughter, the child he'd once carried on his shoulders, while Martha painted the porch. "I am," he said quietly. "Because for once I did the right thing." She turned away and left without another word. Silence reclaimed the office after the door closed. Susan gathered the paperwork, stacking it neatly again. "That was brutal," she said softly. Robert sank back into the chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Necessary. You know," she said after a moment, "you could have kept it. You could have waited until things cooled down." He shook his head. Keeping it would have meant keeping the pain. Letting go means peace. Outside, sunlight spilled through the window, painting the polished floor in long golden lines. Robert stood, glancing once more at the documents on the table. Signatures, dates, stamps, proof that the past was finally finished. He buttoned his coat. "Thank you, Susan," she smiled. "What will you do now?" He looked toward the window where snowflakes danced in the light. "Drive up to the lake. One last time." As he walked down the hallway, the echo of his footsteps mixed with the faint hum of the city outside. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. No dread, no fear, just a quiet certainty that Martha would have approved. When he stepped into the sunlight, it caught the silver in his hair, the same color as the lake on a calm morning. And for a fleeting moment, he thought he could hear her voice again. "You built it with love, Rob. Now you're free." He smiled. "I am." The drive back to Crystal Lake took most of the afternoon. By the time Robert reached the familiar turnoff, the sky had deepened into a quiet amber, the sun sliding low behind the trees. The air smelled of cedar and melting snow. He parked by the gate and walked the rest of the way, hands in his coat pockets, the cold biting through the fabric. The villa stood exactly as it always had. Simple, sturdy, still beautiful. Only now it belonged to no one and to everyone at once. The key fit perfectly in the lock. He turned it, stepping into silence. No flashing lights, no mechanical voice, no hum of hidden wires, just peace. The faint creak of the floorboards greeted him like an old friend. He moved slowly from room to room, touching the edges of furniture, running his fingers along the frame of Martha's old photograph. The house had a pulse again, but this time it was calm, the rhythm of acceptance. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee and poured it into Martha's chipped green mug. The smell filled the air like memory itself. Through the window, the lake reflected the evening sky, a sheet of gold fading into gray. He stepped onto the porch and stood there for a long time, the wind brushing against his face. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "She's safe now. So am I." The breeze shifted, whispering through the pines like a voice he almost recognized. "You did well, Rob." He smiled faintly. "I hope so." His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Anna. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't understand until now. I just don't know how to fix it." Robert read the words twice, then placed the phone face down on the porch rail. The screen dimmed, leaving him in the quiet glow of dusk. "Some things can't be fixed," he murmured. "Only learned." He sat down, sipping his coffee, watching the ripples on the water fade as the first stars appeared. The air grew colder, but he didn't mind. The world finally felt honest again. Behind him, the villa's lights flicked on automatically, not in warning this time, but in welcome. The house seemed to breathe with him, alive but at rest. He looked at the door one last time, then whispered, "Thank you." The wind answered softly, carrying the faint echo of Martha's laughter across the lake. For the first time in years, Robert closed his eyes without fear, knowing the past was quiet now, and that guilt-like love would always echo somewhere beyond the walls. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a regret, know that you're not alone. Take a second to share it so someone else can feel understood too. Thank you for watching.